Hey guys, in this video we're going to be covering target 3B.1. Our learning objective here is I can solve quadratic equations involving imaginary numbers by taking the square root. So this whole section we're going to be taking the square root. When you cannot factor, solve quadratic equations by taking the square root or completing the square, which might result in some imaginary solution. So remember, imaginary just means that it has like a little I, which means you were taking the square root of a negative number. So that's what it means when we are solving and we get some imaginary solutions. Typically, we are in the standard form, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. It is a quadratic equation, which is a parabola. Parabola just means it was that U shape. Remember, either facing upward if it was a positive or facing downward if it was a negative. Second degree, remember, second degree means you have that x squared, which means that you will have two complex solutions. So one thing to remember is that exponent, so whatever the exponent is, that power of 2, means that we have two solutions, okay? So basically, how many eyes do you have? Literally think of the eyes on your face. How many eyes do you have? 2. The reason is because they always are in pairs. So some numbers of imaginary solutions always come in their pair. So if you have a positive eye, you're always going to have that negative eye involved. So there's always comes in pairs. And you just have to kind of remember that to make sure that you're accounting for all solutions. So let's kind of look at these first examples of what it looks like to actually solve these equations by taking the square root. All right, so I have x squared plus 4 equals 0. Step 1 is make sure what is being squared is by itself. So what's being squared is the x squared, right? It's not by itself, which means I have to get it over, move that positive 4 by doing the opposite operation, and I'm going to subtract 4 on each side. That's going to give me x squared is going to equal negative 4. Step 2 says take the square root of both sides. So when I take the square root of both sides, taking the square root of x squared is just x. I know I'm always going to have the plus or minus sign, so please just write that in the front. When I take the square root of that 4, I'm going to have 4 times that negative 1. Now some things to remember too. I'm going to bring down that plus and minus sign. When I take the square root of 4, that is 2. And square root of a negative, remember you cannot take the square root of a negative. So that is why square root of a negative 1 is going to be I. So how many answers? We have 2 answers, right? There is a positive and a negative answer. So 2. 1 is positive, 1 is negative. And what I mean by that is that looking at these answers, I have x plus equals plus or minus 2i. What that means is that I have a positive 2i and I have a negative 2i. Right? That plus or minus sign means that there are 2 answers. All right, looking at example number 2. We have x squared minus 6 equals 0. Same steps. I want to eliminate, get that variable by itself, whatever's being squared. So I do the opposite operation, which means add 6 on each side. All right, I have x squared then. Negative 6 plus 6 is 0. 0 plus 6 is 6. I then take the square root of both sides. Square root of x squared is x equals. It will have a plus or minus sign. And there is no square root of 6, so I just leave it as square root of 6. Another thing to note here is that that was not even a negative. So little star here, just so that you know, there is no I because there's no negative. Okay, what I mean about that is that there is no negative underneath the square root sign. So if there is no negative 1, or a negative, there is no I in your answer. So don't get like I happy and start adding i's where they do not belong. Next example, I have x squared plus 7 equals 0. So you want to make sure that whatever is being squared is by itself. So I have to move that 7 over by doing the inverse, the opposite operation, which is subtraction. So I'm going to have x squared is going to equal negative 7. I take the square root of both sides. I know I'm going to have a plus or minus. All right, always have those pairs. It's going to be 7 times a negative 1. So plus or minus. I know there is no square root of 7. But that I, right, we have to have that I because the square root of negative 1 is I. Now this is kind of the tricky part. If you cannot simplify the radical, please make sure you write the I in front of the radical. So if you see that I wrote that I in front of the square root sign, not in front of the plus minus sign, but it is in front of the root. All right, and again, those are two answers. So what we would see here, that plus or minus sign will give us that positive I square root of 7 and that negative I square root of 7. So always remember that there are those two answers. Sometimes you don't see them right away, or you see that plus minus sign. So all that means is that you have those two answers, two solutions. You should always have two. All right, so next step is to number 4. 2x squared minus 10 equals 0. We want to get whatever is being squared by itself. So I'm going to add 10 on both sides, do the opposite operations. All right, I have 2x squared now equals 10. Well, my x squared is still not by itself because it's being multiplied by 2. So the opposite of multiplying is divide. So I'm going to divide both sides by 2. I'm going to have x squared now is equal to 5. I'm going to take the square root of both sides because I want to solve for x. So x is going to equal a plus or minus the square root of 5. There is no square root of 5, so I am done. Again, no I because there was no negative. All right, number 5. 4x squared plus 36 equals 0. I want to get the squared term by itself. So I'm going to subtract 36 from both sides. 4x squared equals a negative 36. I want to isolate that x squared, so I have to do the opposite operation, which is divide by the 4 that it's currently being multiplied by. 4 divided by 4 is 1, so I'm left with x squared equals a negative 36 divided by 4 is a negative 9. When I take the square root of both sides, I have x is equal to a plus or minus square root. I'm going to go ahead and separate my square root of 9 and my times my negative 1. I'm going to go ahead and draw my arrow up here. So that x is going to equal plus or minus square root of 9 is 3. Square root of a negative 1 is an I. All right, looking at number 6, I have 3x squared plus 27 equals 0. So again, isolate whatever is being squared. So I'm going to subtract 27 on both sides. 3x squared is going to equal a negative 27. I am multiplying by a 3, so the opposite is divide by 3. X squared is going to equal a negative 9. We want to take the square root of both sides. So taking the square root of both sides is going to give me x equals plus or minus the square root. I'm going to go ahead and separate my 9 and the negative 1. So x is going to equal a plus or minus square root of 9 is 3. Square root of a negative 1 is I. So again, we see those two answers, right? We have that positive 3i and that negative 3i. All right, now looking at number 7, slightly different, but again, what is being squared? What is being squared is this whole quantity, right? That x minus 6 quantity squared. So that's what I want to isolate first. So what I have to get rid of is this 1 by doing the opposite. Since I'm adding 1, I'm going to subtract 1 on each side. I'm going to bring down that x minus 6 quantity squared, right? So what's being squared? Negative 4 minus 1 is a -5. Again, they're the same sign, so I add them together and keep that negative sign. And now I want to get rid of that squared. So just like what I was doing before, I have to take the square root. When I take the square root of something that's being squared, I'm just left with that base, which is going to be x minus 6. And then I'm going to have the square root of a -5. So again, I will have my plus or minus sign. I am going to have my 5 times my -1. So I'm going to kind of simplify the right side here. So this is going to be x minus 6 equals plus or minus. I'm going to take that I out. So again, when you cannot take the square root of a number, please remove that I and place it in front of the square root sign. Alright, so there is no square root of 5. I'm not done yet. I have to isolate that variable still, and it's currently being subtracted by 6. So I want to add 6 to both sides. Alright, so my answer then is going to be, I'm going to draw a little arrow over here, and it's going to be x is equal to, if I was adding 6, I have 6 plus or minus I times the square root of 5. Right, so that is my answer. For you to kind of remember, where do we see those two answers? That comes from this plus or minus sign. So what my answers then are going to be are x equals a positive 6 plus I times the square root of 5. And the other solution is going to be x equals 6 minus I square root of 5. So again, that plus minus sign does not change the 6. It changes that I. Either you're adding it or you're subtracting it. So that's where you see those two solutions. All right, let's practice this two more times here. I have actually 8, 9, 10, and 11. Doing that same process as what we were doing in number 7. So again, isolate what's being squared. X plus 2 is what's being squared. So I have to add 3 on each side. So x plus 2 quantity squared is going to equal a -5. Notice I have a -8 plus 3. They're opposite signs, so I subtract them and take the sign of the larger number. I then take the square root of both sides. Taking the square root of something that's being squared is just left with my base, which is x plus 2. I do have my plus and minus sign. I'm going to separate my 5 times my -1. X plus 2. Bring over my plus minus sign. That -1 is my I. Right? There is no square root of 5, so I'm just going to add that on n. Again, notice the I is in front of the square root sign. I have to get x by itself, so I am now going to subtract 2 over to the other side. So now here my answer is going to be -2 plus or minus I times the square root of 5. Those are not like terms, so we cannot combine them, right? Not like terms. Just like in number 7, those are not like terms, right? Not like terms. Number 7 too, if you want to kind of go back there, look at number 7, our final answer. Those were not like terms again, right? These were not like terms. You cannot combine them. One has an I, one does not. One is imaginary, one is not. Right? So those are not like terms. Let's look at number 9 here. I have the quantity of x minus 5 squared minus 2 equals 98. So I'm going to add 2 on both sides. This is going to be the quantity of x minus 5 squared equals 100. I'm going to take the square root of both sides. X minus 5 is going to equal a plus or minus 10. I then want to isolate my x, so I have to do the opposite operation, and I have to add 5. I'm going to have x equals 5 plus or minus 10. But now, if I look at this, I do not have any i's, right? I have a 5 and I have a 10. So these actually are like terms. So I do have to combine them one more time. So if I have x equals 5 plus or minus 10, my two options then is going to be 5 plus 10, which is going to be, right, x equals 15. And then I'm going to also have that x equals 5 minus 10, which is going to be x equals a negative 5. So my two solutions then, I did not have imaginary solutions in this example. My answers then are just going to be x equals 15, x equals negative 5. So again, those would be our intercepts. Looking at number 10, still have to isolate what's being squared, right? Doing those order of operations backwards. So I want to subtract 1, have 3 times x plus 3 quantity squared equals 27. I want to divide now. I cannot take the square root just yet because whatever is being squared is still attached to that 3. So the opposite would be to divide by 3 on both sides. I'm left with x plus 3 quantity squared is going to equal 9. I then take the square root of both sides. This is going to be x plus 3 is going to equal a plus or minus 3. Right? Square root of 9 is 3. Again, no i's because there's no negatives. I'm going to subtract 3 on each side. So therefore, I'm left with x is going to equal negative 3 plus or minus 3. So what are my two solutions here? I have x is equal to negative 3 plus 3, which is equal to 0. And then I have x equals negative 3 minus 3, which is negative 6. So those would be my two solutions, x equals 0 and x equals a negative 6. So again, that plus or minus sign tells you add or subtract the second term. All right, last example here. 5 times the quantity of x minus 1 squared plus 55 equals 70. So again, isolate whatever is being squared. I have to subtract 55 over to the other side. So 5 times x minus 1 squared equals 70 minus 55 is 15. I want to divide by 5. X minus 1 quantity squared. 15 divided by 5 is 3. I need to take the square root of both sides to get rid of that square to get my x by itself. So x minus 1 equals square root of 3. There is no square root of 3, but I do still need my plus or minus sign. I then add 1. So my answer then is going to be x equals 1. Let's do that. 1 plus or minus, I apologize. Alright, so we have 1 plus or minus square root of 3. Those are not like terms, right? What is the square root? What is a 3? So these is my answer right here. 1 plus square root of 3, 1 minus square root of 3. Alright, go ahead and practice some of these. You can move on to activity 3B.1. Good luck.